Welcome, everyone. We are midway through MarshWatch, so this is the fifth one in the series of 10, and we are starting Bird ID session number 4. Before we get started, I'd just like to say that I'm joining you today from Saskatoon, which is located on Treaty 6 territory, encompassing the traditional homelands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people. My name is Leanne Laftermoy, and if you're joining for the first time, because we still have people joining even midway through the season, I work for an organization called Birds Canada. We're a Canadian not-for-profit, and our mission is to drive action to increase understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. I got my start at Birds Canada with the species that we're going to be covering tonight, the least bittern, and you can see me up in the top right-hand corner there back in 2008. That was my second field season. Out there surveying for least bitterns. So it was really least bitterns that made it so that I have the career that I have today. Super grateful to be able to do this kind of programming with you. I enjoy it immensely, and I do love wetlands. The agenda for this evening, we've got some birds and amphibian ID to cover, and we're also going to do a few invasive plant species. All of that is going to be recorded and posted online. Then we're going to turn off the recording, and then we'll get to the quizzes and discussion portion of the evening. Without further ado, here's our slate of bird and amphibian species for the evening. We've got 2 more dabblers, the Gadwall and the American Wigeon. Then we've got the great blue heron, the American bittern, the least bittern, and the Wilson's Phalarope. And to tie off the evening, we've got a couple of toads and obviously some invasive species plants after that. But this is the main suite of species for this evening's discussion. Let's get right into it because I do love Gadwall. I think they are such a handsome little duck. They're really overlooked. They don't tend to taste the greatest, so a lot of hunters really don't like them. But they're a handsome, kind of subdued little duck. Seen up close, there's all kinds of patterning and variation, but for the most part, you're not there with the duck in your hand. At a distance, the thing that really stands out about the Gadwall is that rear end. It is black. You can see tiny little colored, pale feathering, but there's a great big chunk of the rear end that is just jet black. And that stands out like a sore thumb. At a distance, all of that kind of beautiful variegation and patterning on the Gadwall, like this photo down here that's a little bit far away and blurry, it all just kind of blends into a gray looking duck. So these guys are really, super easy to tell if they're males at a distance because you just see a grayish kind of blob, gray brownish blob with this jet black rear end, and you've narrowed it down completely. That is a Gadwall. They're a fairly large dabbling duck, smaller than the mallard, but still not, itty bitty like the teals that we spoke about recently. The speculum is actually kind of nice, I think, because it's got this little white patch, this little kind of, it's almost a square shaped or a little bit of a rectangle shape. Both the hen and the drake will show that, and the drake will have an additional kind of rusty patch on the speculum here, on the kind of forewing patch. And you can see it in this photo. It really stands out, that kind of white square rectangle. It doesn't cover a whole lot of area, but it really does stand out because, like I've said before, anything at a distance that's white really, really stands out at a distance. That's reflecting all the light back at you. Kind of the opposite of what the black does. But in this case, the black is also really useful because, it really does appear jet black at a distance. So very handsome little duck. Their bills on the drakes are typically black, but they can exhibit, especially if they're moving, out of the breeding plumage and into their clips, they can have a little bit of orange along the side of the bill, which is very typical of the hens. Now, the hens, they are very plain, very subdued. You're going, oh gosh, I've seen a lot of mottled brown female ducks. Don't worry, when we do the review session, we're going to go through all of them together and we'll do a comparison today for the larger hens that we've seen that look like, they have a bit of orange on the bill. So let's take a look at her. Got a bit of a steep forehead going on. Some duck species, typically show a bit more rounded. Gadwall has a little bit of a steeper forehead, but the thing to pay attention to is that bill. It's a nice small-sized bill, but it has this kind of orangey tinge to the edges of it, kind of darkish in the center, all the way down to the tip, from the nose, from the nostrils right down to the tip, and then along the edge of the bill, it's got this nice orangey color. Otherwise, she's very, very plain. You can sometimes see that little bit of a white speculum patch as they're floating around, but If you look at the photo below, that's hidden. And that's always going to depend on just exactly how she's got her feathers arranged at the time, what her posture is. You know, if you see them walking around on land, maybe they'll stretch a little wing and you can see a little bit of it. But really, overall, very plain looking brown duck. There isn't a whole lot to write home about. There is a faint little eye line, but that bill with that kind of orange right on the edge and that dark center that runs down the whole length of it is going to point you to Gadwall. And if you think it's, tough to tell her apart from other female ducks, you're right. You're not alone. It is tough. Try practicing, especially in the early season when the ducks are all paired off. Take a look for a gadwall and take a look at the brown hens around that gadwall because chances are you're going to find a female in close proximity. And that's always a good place to start if you're, confused about ducks. Start with the males. They're more showy, they're more, easy to identify, and then work your way up to the females. You don't need to learn anything all at once. These guys are mostly vegetarian, but like most species, when they're trying to put on mass to lay eggs, they're going to be eating a lot of aquatic invertebrants. So the hens do a fair bit of that in the breeding season. Otherwise, they eat a lot of seeds and submerged aquatic vegetation. And I think they have one of the most hilarious sounds of any of the duck species, in part, if you've ever watched Sesame Street or seen reruns. These are the yip yips. They're the aliens that come down and, goof around and try to understand human things. If you remember that episode at all, or the yip yips in general, I find that the Gadwall sound sounds a lot like the yip yips. They go bap, 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 bap. And they're a chatty duck, especially when they're flying. So this is one that it is useful to learn the call. The male's going to be doing that bap, 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 bap call. So I'll play that for you. I think it's hilarious. It makes me smile every time I hear it. Oh no, if I click right as it disappears, we go to the next slide. So if you remember the Yip Yips at all, if you've ever seen Sesame Street, maybe you haven't, but it really does sound like those little aliens going bap 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 bap, and they're quite chatty. I'll play it once more just because it's so ridiculous. Especially when you get a few of them going. It's just kind of absurd that that's the sound that the Gadwall makes. Gadwalls have a fairly central distribution. I don't know how often they get quite out to the east coast, but we see a whole lot of them out here on the northern Great Plains. Okay. Now, what I promised, the comparison for other large dabbling ducks with orange on their bill. And remember the dabbling ducks, they're the ones that have their legs on the center of their body. They're much more adept at walking around on land. They can fly from a standstill, and they mostly feed by, nibbling at the surface or just tipping up, sticking their little bums in the air and getting their heads down. They don't often dive. They'll dive a little bit, especially if they're trying to give themselves a bath and try to really cover themselves in water. But for the most part, they're kind of eating what they can reach from the surface. So first off, we've got the mallard hen. She's got an orange bill that has a nice dark, either splotchy patches or a big kind of dark saddle right in the middle of it. And it really is a bright kind of orange. The speculum patch in the female mallards, the hens, we've got this nice kind of iridescent blue bordered with black and white both above and below. And I find on the mallard hens, just the way they kind of hold themselves, you wind up seeing that patch a little bit more than you do on other species. So take a look at that bill, orange, and take note of where the dark is. It's kind of all clustered right in the center of the bill, and that can be one contiguous kind of lumpy looking patch, kind of like a saddle, or it can be lots of spots kind of right in the center. The northern shoveler, on the other hand, she's got a really large, outsized, kind of shovel-shaped bill. Kind of looks like somebody cut the end off a shoehorn and just made that the duck's bill. It's orange with a bit of olive down the center. It's not really bright orange. It doesn't kind of shine going, oh my, this is a very orange bill. Kind of a bit of a subdued orange with really kind of an orange wash to the top, but really, really large. You know, if you see it at the right angle, it just looks absolutely absurd. The speculum patch on them, green bordered with a little bit of white above. And last but not least, our Gadwall, that orangey bill, dark with orange kind of restricted just to the sides on the edge of the bill. And it's kind of small overall. It looks kind of dainty compared to the mallard and the northern shoveler. And her speculum patch, nice little white square, kind of close to the wing, close to the body where the wing comes out from the body. So those are large dabbling hens with orange on the bill. So hopefully this has helped to demystify them a little bit. And if you ever want, you know, take a screenshot, come back to it later, make notes on the recording. The hens are tricky, but they're not totally impossible, and you can get there. It just takes a fair bit of practice. Okay, next up we have kind of a medium-sized dabbling duck, a little bit smaller than the Gadwall, and that's the American Wigeon. These are a nice little handsome duck. They have a small, stubby kind of blue-gray bill that's edged in black. So the bill is really quite, you know, bold and distinctive. And the drakes are actually fairly variable in terms of their head patterning. The thing that I focus in on for the most part is the thing that catches my eye. If they're close enough, I can see that kind of dusty rose, dusty salmony pink side to the body. It really just looks different than almost all of the other ducks that you see. Of course, that little forehead patch, be it being white or in, you know, occasionally it's more of a straw buffy color, that really does stand out as well, but it can be fairly reduced. So if you take a look at this male over here, this drake on the left-hand side, it's really reduced amount of white, and that dramatic eyeshadow, that kind of green eyeshadow going from the eyes down the side of the head, that is also variable in its extent and brightness. So some of them have just kind of a hint of the eyeshadow and a little bit of white, whereas others have, you know, much more white on the face, really bright white little cap here, and dark dramatic green eyeshadow. On the rear end side of things, the rump is kind of split into two. On the very back half, it's black, but on the other side of the rump, it is nice and white. But again, if you see them kind of close up, that dusky pink really does just stand out as, oh hey, that's something different. It doesn't look like the other duck species. And I'm not sure what drives the variation in the males. It just is typical of the species, you know. They can look a fair bit different from one another. Presumably, you know, they're all rather effective at getting mates because this does persist in the population, so who knows what's driving that sort of thing. The speculum is green with a white patch on the upper wing, that kind of forewing patch. The white is reduced in the females, but otherwise the speculum is kind of iridescent greeny color. So nice handsome little duck here. The hens, they have this kind of, it looks like they've got dark eyeshadow, and it's just kind of centered around the eyes, like kind of just a nice dark smudge. They have a similar bill, kind of blue-gray edged in a little bit of black, and then that kind of dark eyeshadow that's restricted to around the eye area. And if you get into looking at subtler and subtler shades of brown, you'll notice that um, the sides of the hen, they're a little bit warmer brown than a lot of the other hens are, and that kind of mimics what the male looks like, you know, a little bit more of a pinkish tone underlying that brown. But that dark smudge or that dark little bit of eyeshadow, really, really characteristic, and I find that to be really helpful for me in IDing the female. So you'll see nice little brownish hen. Of course, you've got that kind of distinctive bill with the blue, gray, and the black, but that dark smudge around the eye really does show up nicely at a distance. Quite handsome little guys. You can just see there's all kinds of variation in the drake head patterning, but that salmony kind of dusky pink on the side and that black and white rear end still shows up at quite a distance. And again, that bicolored bill. These guys are mostly vegetarian. They eat a lot of aquatic vegetation, upland grasses, including clovers, fruits, and seeds. They'll eat agricultural seeds and leaves. And again, mostly during the laying period, the hens are going to be eating as much protein as they can get from aquatic invertebrates and crustaceans. You'll find them in kind of shallow water wetlands with, you know, a little bit of upland cover. All of the dabbling ducks, they want some amount of kind of quiet upland cover to, you know, build their little nest in. Mallards, on the other hand, you know, those guys sometimes will nest in flower pots in yards. They're less picky, but a lot of species, they like to have a little bit of quiet uplands. These guys are less common overall, I find. You don't see them, as big a numbers for the most part on the landscape as the other dabbling ducks. And they make kind of nice, quiet little zoo, zoo, zoo calls. You don't hear it a ton. It's not like the Gadwalls bep bep bepping that like they do a lot and it's quite loud. This one's kind of more as an FYI, the zoo zoo calls. It was quite a delicate little sound. And you can kind of imagine that that sort of sound isn't going to, have a lot of traveling power. It's not terribly loud. It's not a terribly robust sound. So, if they're on the other side of a decent sized pond, you're not going to hear that little call. And widgeons, they have quite a wide distribution and range across a lot of Canada and parts of the US as well. Okay, let's compare our drakes with the dramatic eyeshadow because we've covered two so far. We've got today's American widgeon, and we also have the green-winged teal. So the American widgeon gonna have that pinkish side, that black and white rear end. The green-winged teal, on the other hand, gonna have that white spur coming up the side of the body. The green-winged teal also has a chestnut face, so the rest of the face is also dark. Whereas in the American widgeon, the rest of the face isn't quite dark. It's kind of speckled and patterned, winds up looking a little bit gray at a distance, and they'll show to some extent that kind of nice little forehead patch. It might not be bright white, might be a little bit more kind of tan colored, or it might be fairly reduced, but they still have that there. They're both small ducks, and they both do have a bit of black and white on the rump. In the green-winged teal, it's more of a white triangle that's kind of edged in black. But again, that nice little white spur for the green-winged teal, chestnut head otherwise. And there's a fair bit of difference in the bill too, right? The green-winged teal drake has a nice dark bill overall, and that American widgeon is going to have this nice pale color and, kind of really, really light, kind of whitish blue color and edged in black. So those are our two drakes with the dramatic eyeshadow. Okay, taking a turn away from the ducks now, we have the great blue heron. This is by far one of the most common herons that you're likely to see, in many parts of North America. They are very, very large. They have a great big yellow blackish bill. It's big, it's wedge shaped. It's kind of one of those all purpose dagger bills. They have a long, slender neck and long legs. Their neck is tucked back in flight. So if you ever thought, hey, I know what a sandhill crane looks like, but great blue heron kind of looks the same. In flight, a sandhill crane, they're going to keep their necks out straight, whereas the great blue heron in flight, they tuck that neck into kind of like a little S shape to tuck it back in there, so it doesn't quite look the same. Both sexes are going to look the same. They're blue-gray overall, slight variations on that theme, a little bit more pinkish colors sometimes in the neck, but for the most part, they've got this bold black eye stripe that runs behind the eye, and on the adults, the crown is nice and white, and it's dark in immature young birds like this one here. But on the adults, that crown is nice and white. The throat and belly are white with dark streaks, but this can be really tough to see, especially depending on where the bird is facing and how they're holding out their feathers. But you can see some of that black and white feathering in this flying bird here. But they are quite large, and during the high breeding season, right at the peak of it, they'll get these lovely ornamental plumes that come off of their head, their neck, and their back, and their breast plumes will also come out. So this one's showing a few nice plumes here, just extra decorations during the breeding season to say, hello, look at me, ladies. You'll find great blue herons at water's edge in a wide variety of habitats. They're after fish primarily, but if you've ever watched great blue herons long enough and often enough, you'll know that if they can catch it with their bills, they will eat it. So that includes everything from amphibians, small invertebrates, reptiles, mammals, other birds. They are not picky. Anything that is an animal is pretty well up for grabs with these guys, and they're an opportunistic ambush predator. So they'll slowly wade or walk around kind of the water's edge, and sometimes, especially if they're seeing some action, they freeze right in place, and then they just kind of load up and get ready, and they watch, and just at the right moment they kind of have this burst of energy, and they poke their heads down into the water and hopefully come up with whatever they can grab. But they do eat all kinds of things, salamanders, bunny rabbits that are, little guys, like anything that's small enough that they can catch. I've seen them, snakes, eels, all kinds of things. They really are, a very, very opportunistic predator. They don't eat the plants or anything, but they'll eat anything that moves around that is small enough. These guys nest colonially in trees, meaning that for the most part, when you find a nest, that's often going to be in a large group of them. They can nest singly, and I have seen it, but for the most part, they tend to form these colonies. So they'll make these great big stick nests, and they'll get together with a bunch of other great blue herons, and they'll all nest together in a colony. And the colony can be quite a ways from water, and they will fly quite a distance away from their nesting colony to whatever hunting or fishing grounds that they have. So they're an interesting species in that way. For the most part, they're silent. They'll occasionally utter some guttural croaks and squawks. This would be more common, within a breeding colony, but you can hear them occasionally as they fly by, making some of these croaks and uh, croaks and squawks. It's not something that you necessarily go, aha, yes, that is a great blue heron. It's more, whoa, what was that noise? It sounded like it came from something big. And then you kind of turn, your attention in the direction of the sound that it makes. I'll just play some for example here, but they can be quite loud. I'll play that once more. I can see George has made an excellent point. Be careful if you're ever trying to rescue an injured heron. The bill can be lethal. They will go for the eyeballs. Um, I remember I had been out at Long Point tagging butterflies for about 6 weeks, and just as I had left, they were setting up a mist net in the marshes. And I remember getting an email from one of my friends who was still there saying, "We caught a great blue heron and no one was harmed." It's just kind of funny because if you're handling a bird like that, you pretty well need two people, one person to wrangle the body and then another to secure the head and the bill, because that thing is a dagger and they will use it against you. Great blue herons have quite a wide distribution, and they're resident over a large area. So you've probably seen a great blue heron if you've been out along, any sort of lake or wetland or even a river. They're really widespread, and they use a whole wide variety of wet habitats to do their hunting and fishing in. Now, another species that's related to the herons is the American bittern, and this is one that you likely haven't seen. This is because they are masters of camouflage and disguise. They're still a fairly large heron, though by no means are they close to, the great blue heron in size. They have a compact body with a thick-looking neck, and it's mostly thick because of the way the feathers are. I'm sure if you stripped them down, it wouldn't be very thick at all, but it has that appearance just because of the way their plumes are structured. And they have relatively short legs. They don't have quite the massive sized legs that the great blue heron is going to have. Both sexes look the same, and they're streaky brown overall, and they have dark flight feathers in flight if you ever get to actually see them in flight. And they really do have cryptic behavior and coloration. So if you can imagine you're trying to spot this thing in a wetland, it's already looking kind of reedy. It almost just looks like dead vegetation, but they actually try to look like dead vegetation. So what they'll do is they'll stick their bill straight up. They can move their eyes in their sockets so they can stick the bill straight up and still be looking forward at you. And they'll actually sway from side to side and try to pretend to just be, a reed in the rest of the wetland. Like, no, no, nothing to see here. I'm just a plant. And I've seen them actually out in the open, like in this photo here, and they'll walk in kind of a jerky fashion. They'll kind of be swaying back and forth as they're walking just to try to blend in with plants. And it's funny to see them when they're actually out in the open like this doing that, because you're wondering, like, there's no plants around you for you to try to look like, but it's so ingrained in them that they still have this kind of, jerky movement and behavior as they're trying to be stealthy. I mean, maybe some of it is they're trying to not be so obvious to their prey, but a lot of it has to do with, just not wanting to be seen at all. You'll see American bitterns typically in large wetlands with emergent vegetation, and for the most part, they need upland habitat to nest in. They can nest also in kind of the edges of marshlands, but they really do, they like to have a fair bit of upland habitat nearby because usually they will build their nest in kind of the thick upland vegetation. They have a really, really fascinating call that it's really low and bassy, and if you've never heard it before, you might have, wondered like what on earth is that sound? On the prairies, we call wetlands sloughs, and this one is called the slough pumper because it sounds like some sort of pumping machine, and I'll play it for you here. And that sound travels a large distance. It is incredible how far away you can hear this. In part, low sounds have, you know, um, longer wavelengths, and that actually helps them, travel. It helps the sound travel farther. So it goes a long way, especially if it's traveling over water. At the very beginning of that, you could hear kind of a clunking sound. And if they're close enough too, you can hear them take a few gulps. So they're kind of taking in air, they're filling up some air sacs that they have, and then they're making that call. So they'll take in a bit of air and then they'll make that sound. So I'll play it once more, maybe twice more. It's really quite a neat and almost haunting sound in the wetland. It's always so cool to hear one of those. For the most part, they're fairly far away and you won't get to see them, but they're very, very neat. They'll often call, dawn and dusk time, and you'll also hear them throughout the night. Okay, once more, just because it's so cool. So yeah, really doesn't sound like, what you would expect a bird to make. They are ambush predators, much like the great blue heron, but they're going to be after smaller things. This is going to have a hard time eating a rabbit for the most part. So, for the most part, they eat insects, amphibians, small fish, small mammals, and crayfish. And here's an example in the bottom left here of the American bittern sticking its head straight up, its beak going to the sky, and it's able to, rotate those eyes to have them look forward so they can still see what's ahead of them while pretending to be, a blade of grass. During the breeding season, they'll get these lovely scruffs and plumes that they'll fluff up and, make themselves look very handsome. I've never seen them do this myself. For the most part, I've mostly just seen them as they flush up from a wetland. I've been doing wetland surveys for so many years before I actually saw one, on the ground, not flying, and I got a good look at it. Like it took years. One other thing, I'll go back to the other slide. In flight, the bitterns have quite rounded wings. They don't have pointed wings at all. So they're it's a little bit of a distinctive flight shape. Like the great blue heron, they tuck their neck in, their legs hang, dangle behind them, and they have these kind of rounded wings and dark flight feathers. The good news, American bitterns have a fairly wide distribution across Canada and a lot of the US. And, we get them a fair bit out on the prairies in areas where, more wetlands are lacking. It's harder to encounter them, but we're pretty lucky here on the prairies that we have lots of wetland embedded in a lot of grass. So always welcome to come out and see our birds here. Okay, the least bittern. For me, this is the bird that, started it all and got me going in this career. So I actually owe a lot to this little bird here. So my very first jobs were, surveying around Turkey Point in southern Ontario near Long Point for a graduate student for 2 summers, trying to, count and find all of the least bitterns that were in a few of the wetlands. This is a small heron-like bird. It actually doesn't weigh more than a Mars bar. So you can imagine, like, this thing is mostly legs, feathers, and neck. There's not a whole lot of body to it. It's pretty compact. It does have a long neck that it can extend out, but for the most part, it kind of keeps it tucked in. Both sexes have contrasting coloration patterns. So there's kind of warm orangey tones to the body, nice kind of streaks down the neck on kind of a white throat, neck, and belly. And their backs are either in the males dark bluish blackish looking. So you can see up here at the back, the tops of the wings and the top of the head, dark blue in the males. In the females, this is more of a chestnut brown. And the female also has slightly darker stripes down the throat. You're going to find least bitterns in large wetlands with dense emergent vegetation and deep water. So really you're looking for places with a fair bit of cattail or bulrush stands. I've seen them more often in cattail stands, but they can occur in bulrush stands. So really, really dense vegetation. They climb around in it. They literally, grab the sides of those cattail leaves and they walk through the vegetation above the water. They'll actually build little floating platforms. So if they can bend down a few parts of cattails or rushes and gather them together, they will actually make sometimes little floating platforms that allow them to, peck at the water and get at their little food sources. So very, very handsome. Not likely to be a species that you're going to see, I did targeted surveys for them for 2 summers, and I probably saw all told like less than a dozen of them, and most of them, the odd time flying away. Heard lots, but they're really a shy, retiring, skulky little species. And skulky just means that they kind of creep around in the vegetation and don't want to be seen. Here's a nice picture of a female. You can see that kind of back color is more of a dark chestnut brown than it is that kind of bluish bluish black, and there's slightly dark kind of streaks along the neck and throatish kind of area along the flanks too. These guys are going to be pecking at stuff from the dense vegetation, usually over deep water, and they're after small fish, insects, amphibians, and small little mammals like little mice and things that might be running around are definitely fair game. At the bottom here, there's a really nice photo showing that kind of acrobatic ability of, the least bittern to really like grab vegetation and just walk through it. It's quite the feat of acrobatics. The males do this cuckoo cooing call, and I will play the pied-billed grebe because we did have a question about that a few weeks back to how to tell the difference. So let's take a listen to the cuckoo cooing call of the male least bittern. So it's sort of a quiet cooing call. It's not loud. It doesn't travel a very large distance. It doesn't go on for terribly long, somewhere between like maybe 3 to 6 coos or coos. And it really isn't a very loud call. So when you do hear it, you can get sometimes a sense for how close or far away a sound is. It sounds like it's coming from relatively close by. So let's play that coo again. And for comparison, let's play the pied-billed grebe because at a distance, it might sound a little bit similar. So let's play the ow hoop call of the pied-billed grebe. So you can kind of hear the similarity, especially at the end where, it just kind of drags on and you just get like enthusiastic hoop, 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 hooing at the end of it. But for the most part, it's a louder sound. And so if it sounds slightly quiet, you're still going to have the sense that it's coming from farther away. There usually is also more to it than just the coo coo cooing call. The least bittern is really going to stick to just the coo coo coo, whereas the piebald grebe, there's a lot more going on in the call. So if you listen for a while, you'll likely hear some of that lead up and those kind of higher pitch notes along with some of the cooing. Let's play the coo 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 again, and then we'll play the piebald grebe again. And the piebald grebe. There's more going on for the most part. They're not just sticking to those little kind of hoop, hoop, hoop noises. There's all of those ow kind of things that go on. And again, it's going to sound like a much louder call. If it's close by, it's going to sound quite loud. And the least bittern is fairly, it's mostly an eastern species. You'll get them a little bit in Manitoba. I think there's been a handful of records of them in Saskatchewan, but they're primarily an eastern species that just ekes into Manitoba a little bit, and then again, the odd one makes its way into Saskatchewan, and who knows? They're probably not successful at finding a mate or anything because there's only the few that make them out here. So this is definitely one that the eastern folks get the leg up on for wetland species here. Okay, and last but not least, for our bird species this evening, we have the Wilson's phalarope. This is an interesting bird, and phalaropes in general, because they have reversed sex roles compared to most other bird species. The females are the ones that are brightly colored and aggressive. They're the ones competing for mates. Usually it's the males that do that sort of thing, but in the phalaropes, it's the females that are kind of the aggressive ones, and the males do all of the parental care. So it's definitely a reversal of roles for the most part. So Wilson's phalarope, kind of small, medium-sized shorebird, and they have a very, very fine needle-like bill that is like it. You could use that if you feel like to almost do some sewing with it. It is so delicate and so fine. They also have a nice teeny tiny little head. They're a very delicately proportioned bird. The females have quite bold coloration. There's a dark stripe from the eye that goes down the back of the head. They have a nice little gray crown, white little chin patch here, and then there's kind of this salmony wash down the throat and belly, and their backs are, colored in kind of rusty reddish tones and blue colors. So those are the females. And the males, especially, you can see in this photo here, the male is the one behind. They're basically like a subdued version of the female. Similar types of patterning, but the colors are not nearly as bold, way, way, way more subdued. So that that gray stripe that the female has, it's more just, or that black stripe that the female has that goes from kind of the bill and the eye down the back of the neck, it's much reduced in the males, just a little bit more brownish looking overall. Darker crown compared to the female's bluish, whitish looking crown. So much more subdued. They're not going to be the ones going around, flying around, calling, making all kinds of racket. They're not going to get into any fights. In the phalaropes, it's the females that do that. They like wetlands with open water in part because their feeding is absolutely adorable. They get out into open water and they will spin in little circles and they will churn up the water with their little feet. And what this does is this creates a little bit of an upwelling. So all the tiny little crustaceans and zooplankton and other little nibbly bits, those all get brought up to the surface in that kind of circle that the phalarope is doing, spinning around, kicking its little feet up, and then you'll see them, pecking at the water surface. So it's very, very cute. In flight, they have this kind of buoyant, erratic flight that really resembles a butterfly. They just kind of looks like they're floating around on very delicate little wings. It's quite something to see. They really do just bob around much like a butterfly does. Here's a nice little photo of one of the females just out on the water, and she's going to be involved in, kicking up her feet and trying to get some food. In flight, the females make this kind of woof, woof call. Very, very cute. And they're pretty easy to see, especially, they'll get agitated if you're nearby, and the females will get up in the air and they'll be fluttering around going woof, woof, woof. So they're fairly easy to spot, especially because their foraging habits also take them like right out into the center of a wetland where there's some open water. If you can see the open water, sometimes it's tough, especially in the prairie wetlands. If there's a whole ring of cattail around a shallow wetland, you're kind of hooped. You're not going to be able to see to the center of that, but you might be able to see the phalaropes flying up from the center. They're a species that has much of, a very central distribution. You'll get them in some patches in, the northeastern US and southeastern Canada, but for the most part, the core of their range is kind of, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, as well as, some of the more northerly central states in the US. Okay, now on to two toads. We've got the Canadian toad and the American toad, and they both look quite similar. They're both kind of these, what do you even call that color? Kind of a sandy brown color. But the key to telling these two apart, if they're not calling, and if you happen to get a close look at them, they have these parietal ridge, or is it the central ridge? I'll have to go to the next slide to get there. Cranial crest. There we go. This is the parotid gland, and this is the cranial crest. So in the cranial crests of the Canadian toad, they touch. They actually come together and meet in the middle. You can see in this little insert here, those ridges that are behind the eye, they actually meet up in the center. Whereas the American toad, those cranial crests, they basically hug the eyeballs. So you can see them here in this photo, and they don't actually touch in the center. There's a space between the two cranial crests. So in the Canadian toad, they touch, and the American toad, they do not touch. So this is pretty useful if you get a close-up look at these toads. And they sound similar as well. So the Canadian toad has a long monotone trill, whereas the American toad has a very long monotone trill. Let's play those. And it is very loud in person. I remember the first time I heard that, it happened to be out in an area where there was an oil derrick running, and I couldn't tell if it was some sort of alarm on the oil derrick or if it was a Canadian toad. I was like, I'm pretty sure that's coming from the wetland right next to the oil derrick, but it took me a bit to convince myself that it was the Canadian toad. Let's listen to the American toad. So there isn't a ton of overlap in the range, but they do overlap, in Manitoba. Let's take a look a little bit more close at the Canadian toad. It's a medium-sized toad, about 3 inches in length, about 7.7.5 centimeters. And that cranial crest again forms a ridge between the eyes that actually touches. So those two ridges join at the base. The body color, as you may have guessed, is variable, as it is with most of the frogs and toads. So it can be tan, it can be brown, it can be green, it can be gray, and they have a warty appearance. And there's often multiple warts surrounded by kind of a darker spot. You'll find these guys in ponds, lakes, and potholes. I'll play another comparison of the two songs in a couple of slides since we just listened to them. And the American toad, slightly larger, about 4 1/3 inches or 11 centimeters in length. And those cranial crests, they form little V's behind the eyes and they do not touch. So those cranial crests, they kind of hug around the eyes of the toad and they don't meet up at the base. Once again, body color, quite variable. They can be brownish, reddish, or olive. And they also do have a warty appearance, though they tend to have fewer warts per spot. Sometimes this can be a little bit harder to distinguish, but for the most part, fewer warts per spot than the Canadian toad. And they're found in a wide variety of terrestrial habitats. Okay, let's play a couple of those again. The Canadian toad, the long monotonous trill, though not quite as long as the American toad. You can hear a second one chime in here. Slightly different frequency. And so oftentimes frogs will do that. They'll try to still stand out from one another, so they'll just shift their frequency just a little bit so that they're not totally, overlapping and they can maybe stand out to a female. And the American toad with that really long monotonous trill. Okay, that brings us back to our, review of the evening so far for the bird sounds. We've got Gadwall and American Wigeon. That Gadwall, it's going to be useful to remember the bepping sound. And if you're a fan of Sesame Street, they sound like the yip yips. Oops, clicked out. All of those lovely bepping sounds. Hopefully, if I've made you laugh with this, it'll stick in your head a little bit easier. You can think of weird little Sesame Street aliens. American Wigeon, they do have a lovely zoo, zoo, zoo call, but it's really not a very loud call, so you're not going to hear it at any great distance, and it's not going to be something you're going to hear super frequently. It just sounds so polite and dainty. Great blue heron, they'll occasionally do some guttural croaks and squawks, but for the most part, they're pretty silent. More of a sound that just makes you look to see what on earth was making that noise. Wilson's Phalarope, the females do this lovely little woof, woof, woof call. Very cute little birds. And our two bitterns, the American bittern, also known as the slough humper out on the prairies. And the least bittern with the coo coo cooing. Pretty quiet. You're going to need to be reasonably close to the bird for you to hear that. Not going to hear it at any great distance. The American bittern call, however, can travel well over a kilometer. And last but not least, I didn't have an annotated soundscape, but I do have another recording of an American bittern. This one comes from around the Fishing Lake area near Foam Lake. So you can actually hear a few of those gulping sounds on the front end as the American bittern is taking in air to fill its air sac. So you'll hear these little kind of cluck, cluck noises. So not a terribly exciting soundscape this week. I'm sorry I didn't have time to put one together, but hopefully I can get one up for next week. Okay, on to a few invasive plant species. So 2 weeks ago, we spoke about some native plants, and we did mention that there was a native species of Phragmites. For the most part, though, if you've seen Phragmites or the common reed, you've likely seen the invasive one. They really are great at colonizing ditches because they're quite salt tolerant, and they tend to be, found in an area where they take over very quickly, and that kind of makes them the invasive species that they are. They'll form these great big monoculture stands, and they'll outcompete and choke out all of the native species that would normally be growing there. So they're actually quite beautiful, unfortunately. They make these quite lovely seed heads that are quite, nice and fluffy, but they can be incredibly tall. I've seen some that have been 10 feet tall, if not more. If you've ever had to walk through them, there really is nothing else growing where that Phragmites is growing. It's a little bit eerie to be in that kind of thick of them. I've had to walk through massive stands, and it's dark in there. It's almost like walking through a mini jungle. So it is kind of difficult, though, to tell the invasive Phragmites from the native species. And unless you're a plant nerd, which some of you might well be, it can be really tough to tell these two species apart. One of the better ways I think to do is to take a look at the stand in the fall, because the native species, the stems of the plant turn this kind of bright reddish color in the fall. And so it's probably going to be, for the most part, for us, the easiest way to tell, because I don't know that most of you walk around with a hand lens to take a look at the tiny little leaf parts. So, if you take apart, some grass, where the leaf blade comes off, there's actually a sheath that goes around the stem. And where that sheath and leaf connects, there's a tiny little ligule. And there's like differences of millimeters in terms of the distance of it. So it's really, really subtle. You can also take a look at those seed heads and the lower gloom, which is it's a little capsule that surrounds the seed and the flower. Apparently, they're shorter. The lower ones are shorter in the invasive Phragmites, between 2.6 and 4.2 millimeters long, and the lower glooms are longer in the native Phragmites, between 3.8 and 7 millimeters long. There is some overlap, and again, most of us aren't going to be going out with a hand lens, so oftentimes, especially if you're seeing, Phragmites, it unfortunately is going to be the invasive one. I don't find that I see a ton of the invasive one here in Saskatchewan, but I haven't been everywhere. Usually I just see small stands of the native Phragmites. So just know that there are two, and there is one that is native, but by and large, the most that you're going to be seeing, especially, if you're driving along the highway and you see it all in the ditches, I can almost guarantee you that that's going to be the invasive Phragmites species. And again, that nice bright red stem in the fall can be really helpful, but you have to be there at the right time of year. Another species is the flowering rush. This is quite beautiful, and I didn't know that it was an invasive species for a long time. It's not in some the places that I've seen it, there haven't been massive stands of it, but they can grow into large problem patches. So they're beautiful little pink flowers in an umbel, so meaning that the flower petals or the flower stems all join to a central location on the stalk. Their leaves and long and pointed, about a meter long and triangular in cross section. And you're going to find them in slow moving or still water that's up to 3 meters deep. I found, I think, the first patch of them in Saskatchewan or the second on a paddle trip along the South Saskatchewan River. They have them in Alberta along the South Saskatchewan River, and they're making their way into Saskatchewan. And so there's efforts underway to manually remove them from some of the waterways, but they are creeping into the province. And purple loosestrife is one that folks have probably heard the name. You've probably seen it. It really is a beautiful flower. It's got bright purple flowers in spikes. They have square stems and paired leaves. If you know, botany a little bit, they're in the mint family. And so they have the similar kind of mint leaf arrangement, square stems with opposite paired leaves. They have a smooth edge, and the leaves are found at right angles to the stem. You'll find these in ditches, wet meadows, marshes, and lakes. And here's that example of the stem, square in cross section. There isn't a ton of them out on the prairies yet, but we do have them in Saskatoon along the riverbank. And last but not least is the invasive water hyacinth. This is a floating plant. It's native to South America, and it's got beautiful showy flowers that I'll show you here in a second. But these green leaves have this floating kind of bladder at the bottom of them and make them, you know, float around and make them really, really great at choking out all of the light that goes down under into the water. So their flowers are beautiful, and they've been, you know, spread naturalized and are invasive in some places, you know, worldwide essentially, in part because they do have really beautiful flowers, and they do still sell them, you know, at most garden centers. And here in Saskatchewan, they're not going to survive the winter, but in other places they do, and they can be a problem. So if you take a look at this lovely little wetland here, it is completely choked out with water hyacinth, and that can really impact, you know, the quality of water that a wetland basin has. You know, you can imagine all of this. There's going to be, you know, phytoplankton in the water, you know, aquatic species that are submerged. They're not going to be getting any light anymore, so those will end up dying off. Apparently they transpire a lot, so you know they tend to dry up lakes or wetlands because they lose a lot more water than a lot of the native species would. And again, they really are just quite prolific. They do tend to choke out water bodies, which can limit fishing opportunities. They can just clog up waterways, making it difficult for people to get around on waterways. So they're very pretty, but I wouldn't recommend buying them. And please, 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 like if you ever don't want your aquarium anything anymore, don't dispose of your pets or wetland plants in a native system, because pretty much everything that you're growing in your little wetland aquarium or your aquarium is not going to be a native species. And some of those that you do dump, they can be quite problematic. Goldfish get huge in the right circumstances. So anyway, that's my little soapbox. Don't buy invasive species and plant them, please, if you can. Um, the best place, though, especially if you're, you know, finding invasive species, is to submit those on iNaturalist. iNaturalist is used by a lot of organizations for a lot of taxa. Birds, for the most part, most of the bird data goes to eBird, and that's a better place for collecting information that you would about birds. But iNaturalist is great for pretty much everything else. I mean, birds too. I wouldn't stop anybody from putting, you know, their bird sightings on there, but iNaturalist can really help out with, you know, identifying where invasive species are at. It's pretty easy. Record observations, share them, and, you know, discuss findings. So if you are interested in submitting, you know, plant photos or amphibians or anything to iNaturalist, absolutely go ahead. That's where I put a lot of my mushroom pictures. So iNaturalist is a great little place. And that's all I have for you this evening. I want to thank you for joining me. For the recorded portion, we'll get to the quizzes and the discussion part later, but you can reach out to me at llatchamoy@birdscanada.org. You can follow Birds Canada on all of the socials. We are a national not-for-profit, so if you know, are so inclined and give to charitable organizations, do keep us in mind. Your donations do help bird conservation. I'd also like to thank the supporters of MarshWatch. They're providing continued funding to help this program, you know, happen every year and keep going, and, you know, we keep improving on it. So a big shout out to Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, as well as Wildlife Habitat Canada. Anyway, thank you guys, and let's get on to the non-recorded portion, shall we?